Welcome back to the channel. Previously, I did a video on monkeypox. Not a lot was known, and I talked about that. I saw that the New York Health Department said you could consider wearing a mask, presumably a cloth mask, they didn't specify which, in public to help you avoid monkeypox. I thought it was a bit much. I thought we might rather have some evidence before we started making broad population-level assertions. I've now followed it a little bit more closely, and I have a few more thoughts. First, I want to say the appetite for this is very, very high. You know, when you look on Twitter, I found several threads with thousands and thousands of retweets. Thousands of people are interested in this issue. I really have to say, first off, that I don't think it would be this way if we didn't just have SARS-CoV-2. I don't think there would have been this level of interest in infectious disease. So I think that's one thing worth saying, is that we may be a little bit upwardly biased in terms of our interest by what has just happened. Now, that doesn't mean, this isn't a serious threat and we shouldn't take it seriously. I just think it's just a statement of fact that I wonder if this had happened in 2012, if we would have been similarly interested. I want to read a few excerpts from some threads I've looked at because I think they kind of tell a very interesting story. So the first is from a virologist. Now, I'll just say what this person said, and then I'll get to my points. Given the recent interest in monkeypox, here's a few things people should know about the pox viruses from a virologist's point of view. Yippee. Virologists classify pox viruses as large DNA virus in the kingdom of Bamfordviridae. Bamfordviridae, okay, I didn't know that. Alongside other animal viruses like adeno and asfari viruses, all of which have a protein with a double jelly roll fold. Oh, interesting. I really think this is when you're talking about, this is like information porn. Because the average person, doesn't really need to know what kingdom this is in. And the average person doesn't really need to know it has a double jelly fold roll, and they may not even know what that is. And I don't just really see how it's useful to anybody, but, it's generating a lot of interest because it's feels like something that might help you. He goes on. Pox viruses are unusual for DNA viruses in that they replicate in the host cell's cytoplasm and not the nucleus. Pox virus particles also have an enigmatic and complex structure. Again, I just don't think the average person would care one way or the other. I'm not even sure the average doctor would care one way or the other if it replicates in the cytoplasm or in the nucleus. Maybe the drug development people might care insofar as it leads to a different therapeutic strategy. But I guess I do worry we're kind of, being seduced by information porn here. He goes on, the most well-known pox virus is the virus that caused a devastatingly lethal, debilitating, and history-changing smallpox. And I think, that's a fair point that I think people should be drawn their attention to. 500 million people have had smallpox since 1880. Variola virus was controlled with the original Jennerian vaccination, which is inoculation with a related virus found in animals, giving cross protection. That was the classic cowpox, smallpox, Edward Jenner kind of story. And I think that's interesting for people to kind of have that historical memory jogged. Given the significant diversity and generalist predisposition, pox viruses often jump from one host species to another. This one likely rodents. One of the best examples is monkeypox or cowpox, both of which are actually rodent-born. Okay, I can see why somebody might wish to know that. Sure, fair. The last point. Pox virus diseases are known to be vaccine preventable. There's significant cross-protection between different orthopox infections, meaning our smallpox vaccine might have some cross-protection. There might be even some useful antivirals out there, and he has a picture of cidofovir. And I spent some time trying to track down, what is the evidence for cidofovir? And the best I found was this: cidofovir, brincidofovir, and another antiviral evaluated in vitro and animal studies have no efficacy data in human beings. So I guess I gotta say that I think this is one of the things that happens when you listen to a virologist, which is that, in the mind of a virologist, in vitro or animal studies is super and supremely important and interesting. But in the mind of a doctor, I want to know what human studies exist, and there are none. So that's worth noting, but I wouldn't have touted it so highly in my thread. But, I think that's just the perspective somebody brings. It's really interesting to me that, 10 years ago, nobody, the average person, the public, certainly wouldn't be reading a thread like this. And even the reporter listening to this person wouldn't think to amplify it because they'd think nobody would be interested. But now it's gaining, massive traction on social media. All right, let me go to the next thread. Now, this is a thread by a physician, a infectious disease doctor. And I think that might be at least one of the reasons why I think it's just much more practical and relevant. Here's what she has to say. As the monkeypox virus outbreak continues, a lot of data emerging in real time and being rapidly disseminated. as well as misinformation. There's always misinformation. I compiled a list of things we know and what we don't know. Here's some links. First, monkeypox virus is not a novel virus. It's a viral zoonosis that was first discovered in 1958. With the first human infection reported in 1970, is classified as a high-priority pathogen by the WHO and mostly identified in Central and Western Africa until now. I think, it's very reasonable to know where it's normally identified. I think the year it was discovered and the year it was first documented, I think, are very useful information. I think pretty useful. Confirmed and suspected cases of monkeypox now reach 145. This is from May 21st, so it may be a little bit dated by the time you're watching this. 13 countries, 20 cases in the UK. The main concern is that there are non-travel associated cases in Europe, meaning there's unnoticed community transmission. Again, I think this is bringing you right to the point. What is the concern that's novel here? It's that there may be transmission in person to person in Europe. The first case was identified in London on May 7th, related to travel from Nigeria, followed by additional cases across England and the first outbreak in Europe. This is beyond what was previously experienced. The precise drivers are ongoing. Global risk is not entirely well defined. But what we do know is normally monkeypox doesn't spread efficiently human to human, and one of the concerns is whether or not this is more transmissible. So I actually think this person's done really kind of a really good job of setting the stage, is this more transmissible or not? What evidence could they bring to bear on this question? And they come forward with some good, I think, preliminary evidence. First genome sequencing of monkeypox shows that the protein appears identical to a sequence from 2018, linked to the UK, which was linked to Nigeria. This preliminary data argues against evolutionary adaptation. So they don't yet see genomic mutations that appear to be much different than prior strains, suggesting that it doesn't appear to be a more transmissible variant. But quickly, this is an expert clinician and scientist, I think, to insert the caveat. Quickly, quote, but sequencing is ongoing. Although these are closely related to the 2018 monkeypox, we can't completely rule out a mutation conferring enhanced transmissibility, and so they're sequencing more and sequencing more. Well, that's a fair point. So now I think I really just like this thread. I thought it was quite interesting and, to point. And this was, I think, the sort of thing that I think a journalist would sort of cover. If monkeypox didn't become better at infecting people, why are we seeing a lot of cases all of a sudden? There are some clues in the epidemiologic data. 65 cases are identified in 4 countries, UK, Portugal, Spain, and Canada, and clusters include cases of men who have sex with men. This raised questions about a new route of transmission, but prolonged close contact is how monkeypox normally spreads. So I think this person makes an excellent point about documenting the demographic characteristics of the people who've been afflicted. Monkeypox primarily presents as a vesicular pustular illness. I think I talked about this in my prior video, so I will refer you to that rather than get into that. It has a longish incubation period, so the cases we're seeing now happened a few weeks ago. And I think that's another important point, to know that there's this much longer lag time so that people might have some idea of what's yet to come, that even if you did some drastic things to change it, you might still have sort of a backlog of cases. This person goes on, talks about the CFR, the case fatality rate, saying it's between 1 and 3.4%, talks about some historical household contact studies showing a 9% secondary attack rate. So if somebody in the house has it, what's the probability somebody else in the house will get it? 9%. Didn't provide a link, though. I would have loved to see that link. I'm very curious what the quality of these historical studies is. As a general rule in biomedicine, when I go back into history and read some old study, most often I'm sort of disappointed in the methods, and I think that there's a lot more uncertainty around the point estimate. That's just my point of view. This is the biggest outbreak outside of Africa. There will be more cases to come. The concern is not necessarily a global pandemic like what we've seen with coronavirus or influenza, but it is important that we deploy public health measures rapidly. They say that they're not delayed. And then they talk about smallpox ring vaccination, which I think I talked about in the prior video. Good thread. And I think already I see some key differences. I don't know if it is because of the fact this person is a clinician and the other person was sort of a lab researcher, but I do think this person is giving me information that I think is more practical and relevant and less what I would consider information porn, which is the sort of thing that, somebody who's anxious might go seek out, but doesn't really actually tell them anything. Double jelly roll fold protein. I mean, what does it even, were you normally in the business of talking about the jelly roll fold proteins in your line of work? And if not, then, it's probably not going to be of interest to you or of use to you. Liz Heileman, who's a seasoned reporter, she says this, and I think this is an interesting point. I don't know how to say this without offending anyone, but acknowledging that monkeypox is spreading in gay networks, some gay and bi men have a lot of sex, is not inherently homophobic. And I think she makes a superb point, which is that, any scientist or doctor worth their salt has to be able to talk about issues and the populations they affect without the mere fact that they're talking about it be somehow confused with some sort of bigotry or judgment. It's not a judgment, it's just a mere statement of fact, but it will allow you to target your response. Similarly with SARS-CoV-2, it's not a judgment that it has an extremely steep age gradient and it kills 80-year-olds much more than 8-year-olds, and that fact might be useful for a policy response. I think you can use facts to have better policy response. And then the last thing I want to talk about, this is somebody who I think has been very critical of people who talk about a harm reduction strategy for COVID-19, people who say that, I'm not necessarily sure we should mask toddlers in perpetuity. We don't have cluster randomized data. We don't have evidence that this is clear. There may be some downsides. They clearly don't suffer disproportionately from the disease. They're not doing that poorly from the disease. Do we need to cloth mask toddlers in perpetuity? This person says that kind of narrative is driven by right-wing conspiracy thinking, which I don't think is true. I think it's driven by anyone who is a sensible person approaching the issue. This person has been very critical of that. They have used accusatory languages, like people who promote that kind of narrative may even sort of be responsible for deaths. But this person talks about this virus and says the answer isn't to shut down all these parties, tell gay men to stop having sex or dancing in close proximity with each other. It won't work. It hasn't worked for HIV or other kinds of infectious disease outbreaks among gay men. This is what we should do. Our friend told me this is what we should do. 1, don't panic. 2, don't stigmatize. 3, don't suddenly become sex negative. 4, educate men on what to look for. 5, ask people to stay home if they're sick or have unusual lesions pop up, even if they aren't planning to have sex. If we jump to cancel events and stop having sex, we lose any hope of an effective response if this doesn't burn itself out. Where was this for COVID-19? Of course. I think this is a totally correct and brilliant statement. Correct. You can't tell people not to do things people want to do. You need to find a way to meet people where they are and achieve some sort of compromise and try to stop some spread without compromising everything. We could have done that with COVID-19. We didn't, because a lot of people made it seem like that anytime you talked about trade-offs, anytime you tried to have that narrative about harm reduction or wanting to preserve some things because that's intrinsically important to being a human being, like visiting your loved ones when they're dying, like being able to hold your spouse's hand when they're giving birth, like not being able to give birth without wearing a mask, like a child being able to go to school without a mask. People said that if you're not willing to make those sacrifices, then you're pro-virus or something like that. They had no sense or proportion. They didn't realize the more you push for these hardline, draconian things, the more likely people are to totally discount and ignore you. And so here I think it's nicely articulated, but where was it for COVID-19? And that hypocrisy really, really troubles me. I really just don't understand how this person doesn't see it. They don't see that these are two very similar things. People are people, and you have to meet them where they are. So what have I learned by this tour? I think several points. One, I'm not necessarily sure that the average person in the public is better off by having these threads. I know these threads are going viral because they're appealing to the average person. Why do I know that? Because there's just, like, the retweets and likes are more than the number of doctors out there, and and many people tweeting and liking are not doctors, so they do have a broad appeal. I really worry that for some people, knowledge is not good. It's a way of coping with anxiety that's actually maladaptive. And if you really think about it, if you really are honest with yourself, only a very few people will know whatever that double jelly roll nonsense was that I said. I don't think you will even know what that means. You won't know what is the jelly roll or what isn't. I don't think it matters to you. It replicates in the cytoplasm and not the nucleus. I don't think you know what that, I think, no offense to anybody, maybe even most doctors don't really know if that has any salience or relevance or anything in their life. But having that knowledge may make you feel like you're taking control of something. And I think that's a way in which information can be dangerous. I think in the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic, we lionized a lot of people who had these kinds of mechanistic threads early, and then we turned to them for questions that were not mechanistic at all, like should I close schools? A very complex policy question with very varied and different and competing demands, and yet we turned to these people because they had the most viral thread on how SARS-CoV-2 replicates, et cetera, et cetera. It was a big mistake. We were seduced by reductionist thinking. We were seduced by sort of information porn. And I do see some elements of that there. We're still, easy to, hit that like button on this kind of stuff. That I don't think is very relevant. It does trouble me. I think down the road we will be in a dangerous position. I'm a policy person. When you approach a policy question, it's a very different skill set. It's its own basic science. It's a basic science of thinking about policy. You need to know a lot about the history of medicine, what has worked, what hasn't. You need to know a lot about, I think, policies and whether or not they work. And you need to know a lot about that the best laid plans of mice and men oft go astray. And I don't necessarily believe that a reductionist person will bring that to the table. The next thread, I think this consummate clinician is taking you through sort of the things that I think are interesting. I think they are, really showing you a glimpse of science that doesn't get captured in the textbooks. And that glimpse of science is that scientists really are thinking about sort of philosophical or key questions like, is there something about this virus that makes it more transmissible or not? And then they think, what are the ways in which I can answer that question? Now, genomics is but a surrogate for that, because in the absence of any genomic changes, I think we would say it is highly unlikely that this virus has become much more transmissible. I think we'll agree. In the presence of genomic changes, I don't think we would know for sure it has become more transmissible. I think that would require more studies. And I think the proof would be actually to show that it is in fact more transmissible in some sort of either controlled study or some sort of observational study that is really well controlled. Those are sort of the gold standards. But the scientist is thinking about the question and thinking about what are the best things I can do to answer the question right now. Thus far, we've sequenced this bit. It's the same. Ergo, we have no evidence to suggest it's more transmissible. That's her point. I think it's well done. And actually, if science books were written like this, I think more people would like and appreciate what science is. It's a method of settling disputes. Similarly, a dispute might be whether or not 2 to 4-year-olds benefit from cloth masking, and the way to settle that would be a cluster randomized control trial. I think people would know that if they actually understood science and didn't understand science the way it is taught, which is sort of a set of facts to memorize in a boring way from some boring book. And I think that's most people's impression of science, which is not, I don't think, close to what science is. The third point, I think Liz Heilemann makes an excellent point that we live in a world where it's often taboo to say things that are true, and sometimes when you have taboo things you can't say because you're worried what somebody will think of you or judge you, even if you mean no ill will by it, you're just making a descriptive comment about the world, then you actually can limit your response. You can hinder yourself and make yourself less likely to be successful in your endeavors. And then the final point is, I think this person is absolutely right. You need some sort of harm reduction approach. You need to meet people where they are. As he puts it, if we jump to cancel events and stop having sex, end quote, we will lose any hope of an effective response later if this doesn't burn itself out. Absolutely. And similarly, if you lock down the whole world for, 3 weeks, all in the beginning, you might lose the ability to tell South Dakota in the fall you might want to lock down for a little bit. The vaccine's about to come out. You might lose that ability, which is what happened. Fundamentalism in all its forms is wrong. And it's wrong here too. And this person articulates well, it's wrong with COVID-19. I wish they would just see that connection. So those are my thoughts. This is Monkeypox Part 2, the threads. This is what you get on this channel. I'm a associate professor of epidemiology. This is my interest. Evidence appraisal, thinking about science. These things are my interest. Science communication is a bit of my interest, but I'm much more interested in the way in which sort of society and science are intertwining, especially in the last few years. I think we still don't really have a full bearing on what it will mean, but I think will mean a lot of big things for years to come. And I think, I wish I could say everything about it is good, but it's not all good. Some things are rather concerning. Those are my thoughts. Like, subscribe, comment, leave a message below. Until next time.